I warned them. That land wasn't empty, it was sleeping. But the HOA, they saw a dry lake bed and smelled money. Without asking, they staked their flags, poured their concrete, and built luxury cabins right on top of my family's history. Then had the audacity to name one after me. They laughed when I showed them the old floodgate, called it a relic. So I gave them a history lesson they'd never forget. One night while they slept in their glass palaces, I turned the ancient valve, and by sunrise, their million-dollar getaway was a shimmering ruin. The lake didn't flood them out, it came home. And when it did, the screams of the HOA echoed louder than I ever imagined. It started with a single tongue of orange fire licking up through the tall, brittle grass at the southern edge of the lake bed. I had been walking that same half-mile loop every dawn for more than 30 years. Boots kicking up dust the color of bone eyes, sweeping the cracked clay for fresh erosion scars, coyote tracks, or, if the gods were kind, the delicate heart-shaped print of a mule deer. The basin had been dry so long that children born after the turn of the millennium believed it had always been a desert bowl. They were wrong. This ground still carried the memory of water, the way a soldier carries the memory of incoming shells, quiet, patient, and absolute. That morning, the wind smelled different. Under the usual pine and dust was something sharp and chemical fresh survey paint. I crested the little rise and stopped dead. Bright orange flags snapped on fiberglass stakes driven deep into the lowest part of the basin, exactly where the old inlet used to braid itself into silver threads across the silt. 32 flags at first count, then more as my eyes adjusted, laid out in perfect Euclidean rows that cut straight through the heart of my father's lake. The pattern was unmistakable. I had watched my father stake the very same grid in 1967 when he was still young enough to swing a 16-pound sledge like it weighed nothing. Those flags were not for a road. They were for foundations. The feeling that settled in my gut was the same one I had carried home from Case. A cold, heavy certainty that something you love is about to be taken from you, and there is nothing gentle left to do about it. I stood there a long time, coat flapping, listening to the flags slap against their poles like small arms fire in a distant valley. Then I turned and walked the slow half-mile back to the house, each bootfall deliberate the way a man walks when he has already decided what must be done, but is still negotiating with God about the price. From the porch, the basin looked unchanged at a glance, the same pale scar cupped between two pine-covered ridges, the same hush of wind combing through manzanita. But now it wore those orange flags like fresh stitches across an old wound, bright and obscene. That afternoon, I drove the old Dodge down the switchback to the Pine Ridge HOA office, a low glass and timber temple that smelled of cedar plugins and new money. I rarely come here. My deed predates the subdivision by 19 years. I pay no assessments, attend no ice cream socials, trim no hedges to their approved height. They have never forgiven me for existing outside their covenants. The boy at the reception desk offered the bright, empty smile they must issue, along with the name badge. "Can I help you, sir? I'm here about the orange flag someone drove into my lake bed." His fingers froze above the keyboard. "You mean Parcel 7B? I mean the place where my father and I used to catch bass big enough to pull a 12-year-old boy out of a rowboat." Behind him, a door opened with a soft hydraulic sigh. Lydia Marsh stepped through heels, striking the tile like spent cartridges. Late 50s hair the color of winter wheat suit, the color of gunmetal. She could sell salvation to the devil and still get him to sign the closing table early. "Elias Ryland," she said, extending a hand manicured to a lethal gloss. I left it hanging in the air between us like a bad check. What a surprise. "I'd like to know why your surveyors are staking the bottom of my lake." Her smile never flickered. Technically, Mr. Ryland, the basin, has been non-functional for 22 consecutive years. County records reclassified it as unused common ground in 2011. Your conditional water rights permit lapsed in 2009. Without an active body of water, the land reverted to— It didn't revert, I said. It waited. She tilted her head in that practiced gesture of sympathy that never reaches the eyes. "We're calling the project the Reflection Cabins. 12 luxury short-term rentals. Floor-to-ceiling glass cantilevered decks. Private hot tubs, the whole package. It will raise every property value in Pine Ridge by 30%, even yours. I looked past her through the plate glass wall to the parking lot, where a white Suburban with contractor plates idled exhaust shimmering in the heat. You're planning to pour concrete in the bottom of a lake. A former lake, she corrected, sweet as antifreeze. Emphasis on former. I left without another word, boots ringing on the tile like slow drum beats. That night, I dragged the old ammunition box from beneath the floorboards in the bedroom. Inside lay everything my father had carried home from the county recorder's office in 1967. The original deed with its red ribbon seal, hand-drawn contour maps in his precise engineer's lettering. The water rights permit still sealed in plastic against damp and time. I spread the documents across the kitchen table, under the single hanging bulb, until the room looked like a war room from a forgotten campaign. I read until the words blurred, until the grandfather clock struck 3, and the coyotes started answering one another across the ridges. One marginal note in my father's spidery hand glowed under the lamp like a coal. Stewardship of inflow structures and impoundment shall remain with the Ryland family in perpetuity. They can take the water, son, but they'll never take the gate. Perpetuity. A word bureaucrats hate and water always obeys. I closed the box, slid it back under the floorboards, and stood on the dark porch a long time. Down in the basin, the orange flags kept snapping in the night wind. Tiny tongues of fire licking at the edges of everything I had left of him. I did not sleep. 3 mornings later, I found their letter taped to my mailbox like a death notice on a battlefield cross. No envelope, just one crisp sheet of Pine Ridge HOA letterhead fluttering in the wind, the kind of paper that costs more per ream than most folks around here make in a day. I stood in the gravel driveway in my robe and boots, coffee turning bitter on my tongue, while I read it twice. Per reviewed jurisdictional survey and regional hydrological records, Parcel 7B, formerly Ryland Lakebed, has been reclassified as non-functional common grounds under HOA jurisdiction due to sustained dormancy and non-usage. This letter serves as formal notice of intended construction commencing within 10 business days in accordance with Subdivision Initiative 22A. Any obstruction of authorized work will be subject to civil and criminal penalty. Respectfully, Lydia M. Marsh, President, Kenneth Dalton, Vice President, Mira Chen, Secretary. I read the word obstruction 3 times, tasting metal. Then I folded the page into a tight square, the paper edges sharp enough to cut, and slid it into the drawer beside the coffee pot where I keep matches and grudges. That same afternoon, I drove to county offices in the old Dodge windows down, letting the pine-scented wind scour the anger off my skin. The building smelled of bleach and old paper. I waited 43 minutes on a plastic chair that squeaked every time I breathed. Erica, the clerk with tired eyes and a name tag crooked from too many leaning elbows, finally waved me over. I need the current hydrological status of the basin behind 412 Ridge Road, I said. She typed, frowned, typed again, the keyboard clacking like nervous teeth. It's listed as environmentally dormant since 2013. Removed from the active watershed registry. No recorded inflow since the winter of 2008. That's because I closed the storm gate myself in the fall of 2008, I told her. Didn't want teenagers joyriding ATVs into 6 inches of water and breaking their necks. Gates still there. Still turns. She gave me the look reserved for men who talk about ghosts. Sir, if the permit hasn't been exercised in 15 years, the state considers it forfeited. The HOA filed quiet title 6 months ago. Public notice ran in the legal classifieds for 30 days. No contest was filed. I never saw a notice. You weren't required to if the address of record was the parcel itself. It's a loophole. I laid the original 1967 permit on the counter. The embossed seal had faded to a bruise, but the ink was still black and proud. My father drove to Sacramento with this in a manila envelope. Shook the director's hand. They drank coffee from styrofoam cups and talked about trout. That used to count for something. Erica's gaze softened. I believe you, Mr. Ryland, but the server farm in Salt Lake City doesn't. I left with nothing but a warm photocopy of the quiet title judgment and the smell of copier toner in my nose. That evening, the first convoy arrived. Not bulldozers yet, just gleaming white SUVs with tinted windows and magnetic signs that read Pacific Crest Development, building tomorrow's memories. Men in Patagonia vests and wraparound sunglasses spilled out with laser levels and drones the size of hawks. They strung neon yellow caution tape around the basin like they were gift wrapping a grave. One of them hammered a 4x8 corrugated plastic sign into the ground right where my private road meets the county road. Coming soon. The Reflection Cabins, a quiet luxury getaway for discerning renters, modern comfort, nature-inspired design. Brought to you by Pine Ridge HOA, www.reflectioncabins.com. I stood on the ridge until the sun bled out behind the western ridge, watching them pose for photographs with the sign arms spread wide like conquerors. The wind carried their laughter up the slope light careless, already spending money that still smelled of my father's sweat. One of them pointed toward my house, silhouetted against the sky. Another laughed again. I went inside, poured 2 fingers of rye I didn't drink, and walked out to the barn. The double doors groaned open on hinges I oiled every fall, whether they needed it or not. Inside, the air was thick with cedar shavings and old gasoline. In the far corner, under a tarp gone stiff with dew, lay the Stormgate crank extension rods, nested beside it like the ribs of some iron animal. The blueprint tube stood upright, in the corner read wax seal. Still intact, my father's handwriting visible through the cracked plastic Ryland Stormgate, 1967, do not remove. I pulled the tarp back all the way. Moonlight slanted through the gaps in the siding and painted silver bars across the crank handle. I ran a thumb over the grease I'd packed into the threads last October. Still soft, still ready. Upstream 2 miles through National Forest, no ranger had patrolled since the last government shutdown. The upstream reservoir was already rising. I had hiked up there 10 days earlier with my homemade staff gauge cedar stave marked in my father's chisel cuts and measured 4 feet 2 inches at the spillway lip. Snowpack this year was 180% of normal. By the end of the month, the reservoir would be brimming, pressing against the old stone dam like a secret trying to get out. I covered the gear again, but I left the hasp unlatched and the doors cracked 6 inches so the night air could move through, just in case. That night, I dreamed of water again, only this time. It had a voice. It rose through the floorboards cold against my bare feet and whispered my father's name, then mine, then the single word perpetuity, over and over until the walls shook. I woke before dawn with my heart hammering like incoming artillery and the absolute unshakable knowledge that the lake had not forgotten how to punish arrogance. I brewed coffee I didn't taste, stepped onto the porch, and watched the orange flags glow in the first pale light like the eyes of something waking up angry. The bulldozers came on a Wednesday. I was standing at the kitchen sink rinsing the breakfast plate when the valley filled with a low mechanical growl that rattled the windows in their frames. I knew that sound the way a man knows the cough of his own dying father. I dried my hands, stepped onto the porch, still holding the dish towel, and watched the first yellow Komatsu crest the ridge like a tank coming over the berm. Behind it rolled a parade cement mixers turning slow red barrels flatbeds. Loaded with rebar cages, gravel haulers belching diesel, a trailer of blue porta-johns, and finally a gleaming white command tent that popped open like a mushroom after rain. 12 vehicles in total lined up across the lakebed as if they owned the horizon. The crew wore neon vests and hard hats, the color of new pennies. Someone cranked a Bluetooth speaker, and classic rock rolled across the basin, bouncing off the dry walls like an insult. I stood motionless on the ridge, coffee forgotten in my hand, while they offloaded the dozer and began scraping the topsoil in long, arrogant stripes. Dust rose in slow ochre ghosts that hung in the air long after the machines moved on. Under that dust lay decades of silt my father and I had coaxed from the mountains one spring flood at a time. Under that silt lay the bones of the fish we'd released as fingerlings, feathers of ducks that nested here before the droughts, and the faint sweet memory of my little sister's laughter echoing across water that used to be mirror bright. By noon, the first trench was cut 30 feet long, 2 feet deep, exactly where the inlet used to sing its way into the basin. I walked down in the evening after the crew had gone, boots silent, on the fresh gouge. The soil was still damp 6 inches down, dark as coffee grounds, breathing cool air against my palm when I knelt and pressed my hand into it. The earth was not dead. It was only sleeping. I stayed until the stars came out, then climbed back to the house with Clay on my knees and an ache behind my eyes that had nothing to do with age. The next morning, Lydia Marsh parked her pearl-white Escalade halfway up my private drive, blocking the cattle guard like she owned the deed to gravity itself. She leaned against the hood in sunglasses and a silk blouse the color of fresh cream arms folded, watching me approach. "Morning, Elias," she called, sweet as strychnine. "Move your vehicle. I just wanted a quick word, man to man. You're on my land." She pushed off the hood and fell into step beside me, heels sinking slightly in the gravel. Construction is actually ahead of schedule. We've already had inquiries from Los Angeles and Seattle. Fractional ownership is looking very attractive. These cabins are going to fund a complete renovation of the community clubhouse, new tennis courts, maybe even a pool. I kept walking. She kept talking. "There's still time to be part of it, Elias. We could name the signature cabin after your family, Ryland's Rest, Ryland's Reflection, something tasteful. You could make a quiet 7 figures just by stepping aside." I stopped. The wind moved through the pines overhead like a warning. "That lakebed was never yours to sell." Her smile thinned. "And it was never legally yours to hoard. Progress, Elias. Even you can't stop progress." She pulled a rolled document from her designer bag and held it out like an olive branch wrapped in barbed wire. I didn't take it. "I've thought about your offer," I said, "and I've decided I'd rather keep my name off your mistakes." The smile faltered for the first time, just a flicker, then snapped back into place. She returned to her SUV without another word, tires spitting gravel all the way down the drive. Over the next 10 days, they poured foundations. I watched from the ridge every evening with a pair of Vietnam-era binoculars, sketching dates and coordinates in a marble notebook the way my father taught me when we mapped beaver activity. Concrete trucks growled in before sunrise, their drums turning like slow hearts. Rebar rose from the lakebed in rusty skeletons. The smell of wet cement drifted up the slope and settled over the house like a sickness. They bulldozed a service road straight across the old beaver dam we had left untouched for 30 years. I heard the crack and groan of century-old alder collapsing under treads from half a mile away. Something inside my chest cracked with it. Every night I walked the shoreline of what was no longer a shoreline, checking the Stormgate Trail with a red-lensed flashlight. The upstream reservoir was rising faster than I had dared hope. Snowmelt roared down the granite chutes in thin silver ribbons during the day, and thick white torrents after dark. I measured 12 feet, then 13, then 13 and a half, against my father's cedar stave. Another week, maybe 10 days, and it would overtop the spillway stones whether I opened the gate or not. But I wanted them to feel chosen, not accidental. I wanted them to know whose hand turned the wheel. By the end of the 3rd week, the frames of the first 5 cabins stood proud against the sky, sharp A-frame roofs, walls of glass that caught the sunset and threw it back like a dare. Composite decks reached 20 feet out over the basin floor on stilts, driven deep into earth that had once cupped 10 million gallons of water without complaint. Then came the leasing signs, taller than a man, staked in ground where I had buried my dog Scout a decade ago. Now, leasing. Your private escape in nature, starting at $8.79 a night. That night, I carried a bottle of rye and a lantern to the storm gate. I unwrapped the crank handle, slowly reverently brushing spider silk from the gears. The iron was cold and familiar under my palms. I did not turn it, not yet. But I stood there a long time listening to the upstream reservoir roar in the darkness 2 miles away. A caged ocean begging to be set free. And for the first time in 15 years, I spoke aloud to the night. "They think dry means dead," I told the wind and the stars and the sleeping lake. "Tomorrow we remind them what memory feels like when it wakes up." The rye stayed unopened. The lantern burned until the coyotes quit singing. And somewhere deep under the Ridgewater answered with a voice older than deeds, older than laws, older than every lie ever told on paper. They named one of the cabins Ryland's Reflection without ever asking permission. I discovered it the afternoon a glossy 4-page brochure slid out of my mailbox, like a venomous snake wearing lipstick. The cover was a lie in high-resolution 5 glass-walled cabins, floating palaces, bathed in photoshopped sunset, surrounded by mirror-still water that had not existed here since my daughter was in diapers. A non-existent loon drifted across the fake lake. Even the sky had been enhanced to a shade of lavender you only see in funeral bouquets. Inside the copy oozed reborn serenity on a pristine, underutilized valley floor. Eco-conscious construction on neutral terrain. Harmony of nature and modern comfort. Neutral terrain. As though this ground had no history, no blood, no memory of my mother hanging laundry on a line that stretched across open water. No echo of my father's laugh when a bass hit his lure so hard it nearly yanked him out of the boat. The worst page was the last. There it was stenciled in tasteful serif font, above a rendering of the largest cabin. Ryland's reflection. Signature residence. Sleeps 10. Private chef. Option available. My name, my father's name, turned into a $1.0299 per night souvenir. I stood in the driveway so long the brochure trembled in my hand like a wounded bird. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, screaming once, twice, then banked away as if even the sky couldn't stand to watch. That night, I could not sit still. I paced the house until the floorboards groaned in protest, then carried the brochure out to the barn and pinned it to the wall with a 16-penny nail right at eye level so I would have to look at it every time I checked the crank. They had stolen more than land. They had stolen my grief and were trying to Airbnb it. The next morning I started small, the way you salt a field you intend to burn later. At 3:07 a.m., I walked the subdivision in darkness, thick as wet wool, slipping handmade flyers into every mailbox and under every windshield wipers. Black ink on plain white paper, no graphics, just truth. Real history. Real rights. Real water. Still coming. Ask the HOA why they built on a floodplain they swore was dead. By noon, my phone rang off the hook with neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years, some angry, some curious, one old widow crying because she remembered skating on the lake in 1978. The HOA responded with a cease and desist email before supper signed by a Santa Clara law firm that charged $600 an hour to type threats. I printed the email and pinned it next to the brochure. 2 days later, I filed a public records request for every penny the HOA had spent on the reflection cabins. They fought it, of course, but the county clerk, Don, the same man who'd watched me grow up, slid a fat folder across the counter with a wink that said, "Some rules are still bendable." Inside subcontractor bids, transfer documents, and the smoking gun, a line item dated 7 months earlier. Land acquisition, parcel 7B. Quiet title procedure. $14,200 legal fees. They had taken my lakebed with a courthouse trick and a newspaper ad no one reads. That afternoon, I drove straight-piped the old Dodge to the county recorder's office. Don met me in the hallway, smelling of coffee and righteous indignation. "They never served you personal notice," he muttered, pulling the file. "They claimed diligent search and published in the legal ads. Dirty, but technically legal. Can it be undone? Only if you can prove fraud or get this reassert beneficial use in a manner so dramatic the court can't ignore it." He looked at me over his glasses, something like, oh, I don't know, making the lake reappear overnight. We stared at each other across 40 years of shared history. Thought never crossed my mind, I lied. He grinned like a man watching justice sharpen its own knife. That evening, I hiked up to the upstream reservoir under a moon so bright it turned the forest silver. The water had reached 14 feet 2 inches, lapping at the top row of mossy stones my father and I stacked the summer I was 15. The overflow trench gurgled like a throat clearing itself for speech. I stood on the dam until my boots went numb listening to a million gallons of snowmelt argue with gravity. I did not open the gate, but I peeled the tarp all the way off and left it folded on a stump like a surrender flag no one would ever claim. The following Thursday, they held the ribbon cutting. I watched the live stream from my kitchen on a cracked iPad I only use for weather radar. Lydia stood in front of Ryland's reflection, in a white linen dress, hair perfect, smiling into the camera like she'd invented sunrise itself. This development, she declared, is proof that when we let go of the past, we make room for a brighter future. Applause. Champagne flutes. A travel influencer with 2 million followers took a selfie with the sign that carried my name. I closed the iPad, walked to the barn, and lifted the crank handle for the first time in 15 years. The iron was cold enough to burn. I carried it to the truck, laid it on the passenger seat like a sleeping child, and covered it with my father's old oilskin coat. Then I drove up the switchback to the reservoir again. The moon was gone. The forest was black and breathing. I worked by red flashlight, checking every bolt, every seal, every gear tooth. The crank slid home with a soft, hungry click. I did not turn it, but I left the ratchet engaged, one click from freedom. On the hike down, I passed the false danger sinkhole fence I'd built years ago to keep teenagers away. The brush had grown thick, but the path was still there, a secret trail only 2 living men knew existed. One of them was dead. The other was me. I stood at the gate long after midnight, listening to the water roar behind the iron like a congregation waiting for the preacher to say amen. I spoke aloud, voice hoarse from disuse. They used my name, Dad. They put it on a plaque like it was theirs to sell. The water answered with a low, continuous growl, the sound a sleeping bear makes when it dreams of honey and revenge. I reached out and laid my palm flat against the cold metal wheel. Not yet, but soon. And when it came, it would not knock. It would remember. I wore my marine dress blues to City Hall the first time in 39 years. The jacket still fit, though the brass had gone green at the edges, and the left sleeve carried a faint scar from shrapnel that never quite healed right. I polished the shoes until I could see my own eyes in them, old, tired, but steady. I pinned every ribbon back in place, including the one I never talk about. When you walk into a building full of people who have already decided you're irrelevant, a uniform buys you 5 extra seconds of silence. 5 seconds is sometimes all a man needs to shove the truth down their throats. The city planner's office smelled of burnt coffee and cheap carpet cleaner. Braden Voss was 33, wore a beard trimmed with a laser, and shook my hand like he was afraid the metals might be contagious. I reviewed the package you emailed. He began, tablet glowing between us. Legacy water rights, grandfathered infrastructure, quiet title dispute. Frankly, Mr. Ryland, it's complicated. It's not complicated, I said. They built luxury toilets on a lake bottom. I still own the faucet. He winced. The flood zone maps haven't been updated since 2008. At the time we issued permits, satellite imagery showed bone-dry ground. No red flags. I slid the folder across his desk. Original deed, 1967 permit, my notarized maintenance log showing annual lubrication of the Stormgate from 2009 to present, and 67 photographs of the upstream reservoir rising week by week. I have recent data, I said. He flipped through the pictures, lips tightening. We can't accept private hydrological surveys. So you rubber-stamped $1 million homes on a floodplain because your 2008 spreadsheet said probably dry enough. He adjusted his tie the way men do when they realize the chair they're sitting in is suddenly very hot. We followed process. I leaned forward until the ribbons on my chest caught the fluorescent light. When those cabins are underwater, Braden, I want you to remember those 3 words. We followed process. He had nothing left to say. On my way out, I passed Lydia in the corridor. She was laughing with a councilwoman whose hair looked lacquered by the same firm that did Mount Rushmore. Lydia's eyes flicked to the uniform, to the medals, to the slow, deliberate way I walked. Her smile froze mid-sentence. Oh, she said loudly enough for the entire hallway. Look, it's the gentleman who's been making all the noise. I stopped 2 feet from her, close enough to smell her perfume, something expensive and angry. I haven't even started, I said. The hallway went quiet enough to hear the flag outside snapping in the wind. That afternoon, a code enforcement truck rolled up my drive. Travis the inspector was a good kid, Army Reserve, 2 tours in Afghanistan. He climbed out looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Got an anonymous tip you're tampering with municipal water infrastructure without a license, he said, scratching his neck. I led him through the manzanita to the Stormgate. We pushed aside the false danger sinkhole fence, and I uncovered the wheel. The 1967 installation plate was still riveted to the concrete, property of Ryland family. Do not operate without permission. Travis whistled low. This thing predates the water district. It's grandfathered 6 ways to Sunday. That's what I thought. But you still can't open it without an updated flood impact study in coordination with environmental quality. If you release water into a residential zone, you're looking at felony charges. I met his eyes. And if the water comes on its own, he glanced at the sky, clear and merciless blue, then back at the wheel. Then God help whoever built down there. He logged the visit as a courtesy inspection, climbed back into his truck, and left without another word. That evening, a new notice appeared on my gate, laminated this time like they were afraid rain might wash away their arrogance. Unauthorized maintenance of water infrastructure. Cease operations, immediately pending review. Violators will be prosecuted. I left it hanging there like a trophy. 3 nights later, I filed a whistleblower report with the State Department of Fish and Wildlife Unauthorized construction in a seasonal wetland, destruction of potential habitat for wood frogs and western pond turtles. I attached time-stamped video of frog eggs from 2 springs ago, GPS tagged to the exact spot where they were now pouring concrete. My old service buddy Daniel, now a senior environmental inspector, called me at 2200 hours. "You trying to start a war, Elias?" "I'm trying to finish one." He laughed the way men laugh when they know blood is coming and they're glad it won't be theirs. "I'll have a team on site in 6 days. Hold your fire till then." I hung up and walked to the barn. The crank handle lay on the workbench under the single bulb, gleaming with fresh oil. I wrapped it in the oilskin coat again, carried it to the truck, and laid it gently on the passenger seat like a newborn. Then I drove up the mountain one last time. The upstream reservoir had reached 15 feet, 4 inches. White water poured over the emergency spillway in a constant roar, throwing mist 20 feet into the air. The stone dam trembled with pressure. I stood on the crest, in dress blues getting soaked to the skin, metals ringing like tiny bells, and felt the mountain itself breathing through the gate below me. I did not open it, but I removed the locking pin and left it on the concrete beside the wheel, bright steel glinting in the moonlight like a dare. On the way down, I stopped at the ridge overlooking the basin. The 5 cabins stood glowing with temporary construction lights, arrogant and fragile. Ryland's reflection loomed largest of all its glass walls, reflecting the stars that used to belong to my lake. I spoke into the darkness, voice carrying on the wind. "You wanted my name," I told the night. "You're about to get the rest of me." Somewhere behind me, the reservoir answered with a low, continuous thunder that sounded exactly like a heartbeat. I smiled for the first time in months. The lake was almost ready. So was I. The night I opened the storm gate, the mountain itself seemed to hold its breath. I left the house at 11:47 p.m., wearing the same oilskin coat my father wore the day he first turned that wheel in 1967. No lantern this time. The moon was a thin silver blade, and the stars were bright enough to read guilt by. I carried only the crank, the long extension rod, and a small canvas tool roll that clinked softly with every step. The trail up to the gate was slick with spring melt. Pine needles stuck to my boots like accusations. Halfway there, I passed the false danger sinkhole fence I had built 20 years ago to keep teenagers away. The brush had grown so thick it took both hands to push through. I left the gate hanging open behind me like a mouth that would never close again. The storm gate itself crouched in a notch of granite, half buried under moss and decades of deadfall. I knelt, brushed away a winter's worth of duff, and uncovered the iron wheel. It was cold enough to burn skin. The grease I had packed in every fall was still soft. The gears gleamed black in the moonlight. I did not pray. I did not hesitate. I simply slid the extension rod home, locked the ratchet, planted my boots against the concrete footing the way my father taught me when I was 14, and heaved. The wheel fought me 15 years of rust and silence, screaming all at once. I put my full weight into its shoulder against the spoke breath exploding in white clouds. Once, twice. On the third pull, something inside the mountain gave a low, mournful groan, and the wheel turned a full quarter revolution with a sound like a cathedral door opening after 1,000 years of war. A hiss rose from the throat of the trench, then a cough, then a roar. Water burst through the gate in a solid silver blade, slamming into the downstream channel with a concussion that knocked me back a step backward. The ground vibrated under my boots. Mist exploded upward, cold and sweet-smelling of snowfields and granite, and every spring I had ever lived through. I gave it 3 more full turns, just as the old blueprint demanded for 85% flow, then locked the ratchet and stepped away. The roar became a continuous thunder that swallowed every other sound on the mountain. I stood there long enough to feel the mist soak through my coat, long enough to watch the first white curl of water disappear around the bend toward the basin. Then I followed it. The trail down had become a river. I walked beside the newborn torrent, boots splashing, heart hammering in perfect rhythm with the water. Moonlight painted the forest silver and black. Every rock I passed glistened like it had been waiting its whole life for this moment. The air smelled of mud and electricity and something ancient waking up. When I reached the ridge overlooking the basin, I stopped. The lake was coming home. It poured into the low gut of the valley in a wide, shining sheet, moonlight, skating across its surface like a million knives. The sound was indescribable, part avalanche, part him. Fog rose in slow spirals as cold snowmelt met warmer ground, curling around the cabins, like the breath of something long buried, finally exhaling. The 5 cabins stood on their stilts, lights still burning from motion sensors, looking suddenly small and ridiculous. Their glass walls reflected the moon and the rushing water, and for just a moment, my silhouette standing on the ridge above them. I did not smile yet. I simply watched the water rise. It reached the gravel parking pads, first turning tire ruts into brown rivers. Then it kissed the base of the stilts, soaking into untreated wood with a soft, hungry hiss. Deck boards began to float upward, like piano keys played by invisible hands. One of the decorative lanterns tore loose and bobbed away, still glowing underwater, a tiny drowned star. I stood there until the water lapped at the first step of Ryland's reflection, until the mist thickened and the frogs, real frogs, not the paid actors in their brochure, began to sing in a chorus that shook the night itself. Only then did I allow myself one slow breath. The lake had remembered its shape perfectly, and it was still growing. I walked the long way home along the new shoreline boots, squelching coat heavy with water. Somewhere behind me, a junction box sparked and died with a pathetic pop. The smell of burnt plastic drifting on the wind. I did not look back. Inside the house, I peeled off the soaked oilskin, hung it on the peg by the door where my father's had hung for 40 years, and poured 2 fingers of rye into the same glass he used the night we closed the gate for the first time in 2008. I raised it toward the dark window and the shining valley beyond. To memory, I said. The water answered with a low, satisfied rumble that rattled the coffee cups in the cupboard. I drank it in one swallow, set the glass in the sink, and finally went to bed. I did not sleep. How could I? I had just set a river in motion that had waited 15 years to speak my name. I was still awake at 3:11 a.m. when the first human scream cut through the mist. It came from the basin, thin and sharp, the sound a man makes when he steps outside in slippers and finds an ocean where his driveway used to be. Another voice joined it, then another, until the whole valley echoed with disbelief, panic, and the unmistakable splash of expensive shoes filling with snowmelt. I pulled on dry clothes, took the red-lensed flashlight, and walked down the ridge. The moon had set, but the new lake glowed with its own pale light, phosphorescent from stirred silt and star-reflected sky. Fog drifted in slow ghosts across the surface. The air smelled of mud pine and the sharp tang of shorted electricity. The 5 cabins stood like stunned herons in the flood. Their motion lights flickered on and off as water rocked the sensors. Decks had already lifted free in places. Composite boards floated like pale rafts, knocking gently against glass walls. One hot tub, still bubbling from its timer, had torn loose and drifted 20 yards, trailing its power cord like an umbilical. I moved along the new shoreline in silence, boots silent on wet clay. The frogs sang so loudly, my ears rang. Near Willow Hearth, I found Kenneth Dalton, in silk pajama bottoms and a North Face puffy ankle-deep in water, shining his phone flashlight at the foundation pilings. The beams were tilting. The whole cabin groaned like a ship taking on water. "This is impossible," he kept saying, voice cracking. "This is impossible." Mira Chen stood on the floating deck of Tranquility Cove, clutching a laptop case over her head, mascara streaking down her cheeks in black rivers. "My MacBook. Somebody get my MacBook." Lydia Marsh appeared last, barefoot, white linen dress, plastered to her body hair, hanging in wet ropes. She carried a cordless drill like a weapon. When she saw me standing on the ridge, in dry clothes, the drill slipped from her fingers and sank with a soft plop. "You," she whispered. Then louder, shrill enough to scatter the frogs. "You did this." I said nothing. I simply looked at her across 30 feet of black water that reflected her face back at her like a cruel mirror. She waded toward me until the water reached her thighs, shivering violently. "This is criminal. This is terrorism. I'll have you in federal prison." Behind her, Ryland's reflection gave a deep, exhausted sigh. One corner piling snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The entire cabin lurched sideways, glass walls spiderwebbing in slow motion. A decorative cedar plaque bearing my name tore loose and floated past Lydia's knees. She stared at it as if it had bitten her. I finally spoke, voice calm, carrying easily over the water. "You wanted my name on your brochure. Now you've got it on the water itself." Kenneth splashed over, face purple. "Turn it off, whatever you did. Turn it off right now." I tilted my head toward the darkness upstream, where the roar of the storm gate still thundered like continuous artillery. "It's not a faucet anymore," I said. "It's a river remembering where it lives." Mira started crying in earnest, great gulping sobs that echoed by the loons that had already returned to claim their old nesting grounds. Lydia took another step. The water reached her waist now. The current tugged at her like it knew her. "You'll pay for every dime," she hissed. "Insurance lawsuits, criminal charges." I crouched, picked up a flat stone from the new shoreline, and skipped it across the lake. It danced 4 times before vanishing. "Tell your insurance agent the truth," I said. "Tell them you built on a lakebed that never actually stopped being a lake. Tell them the owner simply reminded it who it belonged to." A loud crack split the night. Willow Hearth listed hard to port. The entire deck tore free and floated away like a life raft, carrying 2 Adirondack chairs and a propane fire pit still cheerfully burning blue. Kenneth screamed something incoherent and lunged after it, slipped, went under, came up sputtering and cursing. Lydia stood frozen water to her chest, staring at the slow-motion destruction of everything she had stolen. I turned to leave. Behind me, her voice cracked, no longer presidential, just a woman, suddenly very small and very wet. "Elias, please." I paused at the ridge line. "Please what, Lydia?" She couldn't answer. The current pulled at her dress. She stumbled, arms windmilling. Kenneth grabbed her elbow just before she went under. I looked at them one last time, 3 architects of arrogance, now standing knee-deep in the consequences they swore didn't exist. Then I walked away. Halfway up the trail, I met the first flashlight beams of the county emergency crew. They stopped when they saw me soaked to the skin, but dry-eyed dress blues hidden under the oilskin. One of them, a young deputy I didn't recognize, shone his light in my face. "Sir, are you the people down there in immediate danger?" I listened to the water, to the frogs, to the slow, patient heartbeat of the mountain. "No," I said. "They're exactly where they chose to be." He stared past me at the glowing lake and the tilting cabins. "Jesus," he whispered. I kept walking. At the house, I hung the oilskin on its peg, poured another finger of rye, and stepped onto the porch. By 4:30 a.m., the water had climbed another 8 inches. Ryland's reflection now floated free of its pilings, tethered only by its power cable, turning slowly in the current like a lazy compass needle trying to find true north. I raised the glass to it. "Welcome home," I told the lake. The lake answered with a sound I hadn't heard in 15 years, the deep, resonant slap of waves against the old shoreline rocks, the same lullaby that put me to sleep every summer night of my childhood. I drank. And for the first time since my father died, I slept 3 hours of perfect, dreamless rest, while outside the valley filled with water and memory, and the slow, inexorable music of justice. When I woke at dawn, the sun was rising over a lake that looked exactly as it had the day my father died. Only now it carried 5 expensive mistakes, gently in its arms, rocking them the way a mother rocks a child who has finally learned not to bite. I brewed coffee, stepped onto the porch, and smiled at the new day. The frogs were still singing. So was I. 6:04 a.m. The sun crested the eastern ridge and turned the new lake into hammered gold. My phone on the kitchen table had been vibrating itself toward the edge for 20 minutes. I let it fall. I was on the porch, black coffee steaming in my hand, watching the valley breathe again. The water had risen another 18 inches overnight. It lay mirror flat and merciless, so beautiful, it looked as though the sky had simply dropped down to live among us. The 5 cabins were now shipwrecks frozen in time. Ryland's reflection listed hard to starboard glass walls starred into glittering spiderwebs, the cedar plaque bearing my name floating past like a tombstone that had lost its grave. Willow Hearth had broken its back. The roof floated upside-down propane fire pit, still hissing blue flames underwater. The other 3 swayed on their stilts, groaning in slow agony, decks torn loose and drifting like pale islands of luxury debris. Down on the new shoreline, a frantic command post had sprung up overnight, 3 white pop-up tents, 2 county sheriff SUVs with light bars strobing a fire rescue rig, and a cluster of engineers in orange vests pounding red survey stakes into the mud. A news drone buzzed overhead, camera lens glinting like the eye of an angry god. Lydia Marsh stood in the middle of it all, hair plastered to her skull, once white silk robe, now gray, and clinging barefoot and shivering, yet still trying to sound presidential. "This is vandalism. This is eco-terrorism. I want that man arrested immediately." The tall, bearded emergency response captain held up a gloved hand the size of a dinner plate. "Ma'am, right now we're trying to determine if this qualifies as an act of God. So far, we've got zero physical evidence of human involvement." Lydia stabbed a trembling finger uphill toward my porch. "He's standing right there drinking coffee." Every head swiveled. 30 pairs of eyes found me in the morning light. I raised my mug in a slow, courteous salute, the way a man toasts old friends he hasn't seen in years. 7:12 a.m., a dusty Crown Victoria rolled up my drive and parked nose to nose with the old Dodge. Detective Lena Marsh, no relation, thank the Lord, climbed out. Mid-40s, sharp cheekbones badge clipped to her belt like it was an afterthought. She didn't bother with the siren, just walked up the steps with the easy stride of someone who has seen every kind of trouble and is no longer impressed. "Morning, Mr. Ryland." "Detective, mind if we talk?" I held the door open. She stepped inside boots, leaving perfect wet prints on the pine floor. Coffee smelled strong in the small kitchen. She declined a cup, but didn't sit at the table, notebook open, pen ready. "We've got 5 partially submerged structures, $2 million in reported damages, and a whole lot of very wet, very angry people who all point at you. Care to tell me what happened?" I leaned against the counter, arms folded. "Nature happened," I said. "Snow melted. Gravity took over. The lake came home." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "Funny thing. County legacy maps show an undocumented storm gate 2 miles north of here, built 1967, never decommissioned. My people found it wide open at 5:17 this morning. No prints on the wheel, no tire tracks, nothing. Just a big iron valve cranked to 85% and a locking pin laid neatly on the concrete like somebody was raised right." I said nothing. Lena tapped her pen against the table. "That gate's still listed under Ryland family stewardship. Technically, the water is yours to release." Technically, I agreed. She studied me a long moment, eyes the color of gunmetal. "Here's the part that interests me," she went on. "If I can't prove a crime, the insurance companies are going to have to pay out on an act of God. And the HOA's lawyers are going to scream bloody murder when they realize their quiet title claim just sank under 6 feet of very real water." I sipped my coffee. She closed the notebook. "Off the record, my granddad used to fish this lake with your dad. Said it was the quietest water in the county. Shame what they tried to do to it." "It was a shame," I said, "but the lake's healing now." Lena stood, tucked the notebook away. At the door, she paused. "If anything else happens, if anyone gets hurt, this conversation turns official real fast. Clear. Crystal." She nodded once, walked back to her car, and left without another word. 8:47 a.m. The first television truck arrived, satellite mast rising like a periscope. By 9, the sky was thick with drones. Someone launched a kayak to get beauty shots of the floating wreckage. The current spun him in lazy circles while he swore on live television. The headline ticker crawled across every regional channel. "Mystery flood swallows luxury HOA development overnight." They kept using the word mystery. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. 10:30 a.m. A procession of official vehicles began climbing my drive, county engineer state, environmental inspector, 2 adjusters in rental sedans, and finally, a very pale Braden Voss, the city planner who had told me we followed process. They gathered on my porch like repentant sinners. The engineer spoke first. "Mr. Ryland, the basin has reclassified itself as an active seasonal wetland in real time. We're reading flow rates consistent with historic spring pulse events." Braden couldn't meet my eyes. "Permits are suspended pending full review. All construction is halted." I nodded, calm as Sunday morning. One of the adjusters cleared his throat. "Sir, if you could provide any documentation regarding the storm gate's operational status." I handed him a manila folder, thick as a Bible, maintenance logs, photographs, the original 1967 permit, and a fresh affidavit, sworn that morning. He opened it, blanched, and passed it down the line like it was on fire. When they left, Braden lingered. "I didn't know," he whispered. "Now you do," I said. He walked back to his Prius, looking 10 years older. Noon brought the letter carriers certified mail from 3 separate law firms, each thicker than the last, demanding millions in damages, threatening injunctions, promising prison. I carried the stack to the fireplace, struck a match, and watched the flames eat their threats 1 page at a time. The smoke smelled of victory and fresh pine. By late afternoon, the viral video hit. 2 million views drone footage of Ryland's reflection, slowly rotating in the current, my name carved in cedars. drifting past the camera like a signature on a masterpiece. Comments poured in. That old man is a legend. HOA picked the wrong grandpa. Water remembers. I closed the laptop and stepped back outside. The lake had found its old contours perfectly. Dragonflies skimmed the surface. A pair of mallards paddled past the sunken hot tub like it had always been their nesting island. Reeds were already pushing green spears through the mud where gravel roads used to be. I walked the new shoreline until sunset boots squishing Heartlight. Near the old inlet, I found the flat skipping stone I'd thrown the night before. I picked it up, turned it over in my palm, and smiled. Every ripple still remembered where it started, and now the whole world did too. The rain came on the third day, soft, steady, patient, the kind that soaks into the bones of the earth and refuses to be argued with. I sat on the porch in my father's old rocker, coffee long gone cold, watching silver curtains drift across the new lake. The surface had turned gunmetal under the low sky, but it was alive. Every raindrop struck a perfect circle that widened, touched another, widened again until the whole valley rippled like the skin of something vast, remembering how to breathe. Below, the command post had shrunk to a single soggy tent and two miserable deputies in yellow slickers. The news trucks were gone. The story had moved on to wildfires and politics. Only the cabins remained half-drowned monuments to hubris rocking gently whenever the wind pushed. Ryland's reflection had finally surrendered sometime after midnight. I heard the death groan from my bedroom, a long, exhausted sigh, as the last intact piling snapped. By dawn, it lay on its side like a beached glass whale roof stove in the fake loft bedroom, now open to the sky. Rain drummed on exposed shiplap and ran pink from the cedar stain, carrying little rivers of sawdust and arrogance into the lake. The other four others were no longer cabins. They were rafts of expensive debris, floating countertops, a stainless steel refrigerator bobbing like a shiny coffin, a king-size mattress swollen fat and dark circling slowly in the current. I watched it all without triumph, only the deep, quiet satisfaction of a man who has returned something stolen to its rightful owner. At 10:17 a.m., a lone figure appeared on the far shore. Lydia Marsh. She wore a navy raincoat, 2 sizes too big, hood-up hands buried in pockets. She stood at the water's edge a long time, perfectly still, staring at the wreckage that had once been her legacy. Then she started walking the shoreline toward my side, slow, deliberate steps, water lapping at her boots. When she reached the point closest to my porch, perhaps 60 yards away, she stopped. We regarded each other across the lake that now legally, undeniably belonged to me again. She didn't shout. She didn't wave a fist or a lawyer's letter. She simply raised one hand, palm open, a gesture so small the rain almost erased it. I wasn't sure if it was greeting surrender or plea. I lifted my coffee mug in return. After a minute, she turned and walked back the way she had come, shoulders hunched against the rain and something heavier. I never saw her on the shoreline again. That afternoon, the county clerk's runner delivered the thickest envelope yet. I carried it inside, slid it open with my father's old case knife, and read standing at the kitchen window so the lake could read along. Official notice, quiet title action, parcel 7B, vacated and declared null and void. Reason, fraudulent omission of material fact, existence of active upstream impoundment, and grandfathered Stormgate infrastructure and reestablishment of beneficial use by original steward. In plain English, the land was mine again. Fully. Finally. Forever. I laughed out loud, a short bark that startled the raven perched on the porch rail. The sound felt foreign in my throat. I couldn't remember the last time it had been there. I carried the papers outside, laid them on the railing, and let the rain fall on them until the ink began to blur. Then I folded the wet pages once and slipped them into the kindling box beside the wood stove. Some victories are best kept close to the fire. The next morning brought a different kind of visitor. A boy on a red bicycle skidded to a stop at my mailbox, maybe 10 years old, freckles, missing front tooth. Eyes wide as the new lake itself. He stared past me, mouth open. "Mister, is the lake real?" I stepped aside so he could see the whole expanse mirror calm reeds waving a great blue heron standing one-legged on the sunken roof of Tranquility Cove like a victorious flag. "Very real," I said. He swallowed. "My dad says it just came back. Like magic." I knelt so we were eye-level, rain dripping from both our hats. "No magic," I told him. "Just someone who remembered its name and spoke it out loud." He considered this solemn as a judge. "Can I fish here someday?" I smiled, the expression feeling new on my face. Anytime you want, son. Bring your dad. Bring worms. Bring manners. The lake likes manners. He grinned so wide the missing tooth became a window to joy, then pedaled off down the road shouting the news to the empty air. Word spread faster than the flood had. By the end of the week, the shore was dotted with quiet pilgrims, old men who had fished here in the 70s, mothers pushing strollers, just to show their children what water looked like when it was allowed to be itself, teenagers sneaking beers and skipping rocks off floating deckboards. No one littered. No one shouted. They came, they looked, some cried, and they left the place cleaner than they found it. The state sent biologists in chest waders who netted wood frog tadpoles the size of fingernails and cheered like they'd discovered penicillin. An osprey pair rebuilt their nest on the highest broken piling of Ryland's Reflection. Within days, the sky was ruled again by wings instead of drones. Insurance adjusters came and went, finding no criminal fingerprints. Only an act of God wearing my boots, paid out in full, and vanished. The HOA dissolved its Reflection Cabins Committee. Rumor said Lydia had resigned, sold her house, and moved to Arizona, where the ground stays conveniently dead. I never asked. Some ghosts are best left unburied. One evening in early June, I carried my father's cedar rocking chair down to the water's edge and set it where the old dock used to be. The lake came right up to the rockers. I sat until sunset, skipping stones, listening to the new chorus of frogs and the soft slap of wavelets against the legs of the chair. A lone canoe drifted past, paddled by a young couple. They raised their hands in shy greeting. I raised mine back. They glided on, whispering, pointing at the heron, the osprey, the dragonflies stitching silver threads across the water. When the stars came out, I spoke their old places above the lake. I finally said the words I had carried for 15 years. I kept the gate, Dad. I kept the promise. The water answered with a long, contented sigh that sounded exactly like his laugh. I closed my eyes and let the lake rock me the way it had when I was a boy, afraid of the dark. Everything was exactly where it belonged. The land had its name back. The water had its voice back. And I had my father back in every ripple, every reed, every breath the valley took. They had tried to bury us under concrete and quiet titles and pretty lies. But water is patient. Water remembers. And on the night it chose to speak my name again, the whole world finally shut up and listened. Years have passed, but the lake never left again. It settled into its old skin like a man returning to a house he built with his own hands, every contour perfect, every depth exactly as memory demanded. Spring brings snowmelt that raises the surface 6, sometimes 8 feet. Summer shrinks it back to reveal rings of dark, fertile mud where willow shoots race skyward. Autumn paints the ridges gold, and the water mirrors fire. Winter locks the valley in silence, and glass and the ice sings when the temperature drops. I am older now. The hair that was iron is snow. The hands that once turned a rusted Stormgate wheel are spotted and slow. But every morning I walk the shore the way I walked it, the day the first dawn after the flood boots, squishing in mud that still smells of pine and possibility. Children fish from the bank with cane poles and red and white bobbers. Their parents nod when they pass my porch, respectful, a little awed the way people nod at living history. Teenagers bring dates at twilight to watch the osprey dive. Old men in canvas hats tell the story to anyone who will listen, and the story grows kinder with each telling the stubborn Marine who opened a gate and brought a lake back to life with nothing but memory and a crank handle. The cabins are gone. Not demolished, gone. Nature finished the job the water started. By the second spring, the last glass wall collapsed inward with a sigh you could hear across the valley. Beavers moved in, built a lodge from the expensive cedar siding, raised 3 generations of kits on the very spot where Lydia Marsh once planned champagne toasts. Otters used the floating refrigerator as a slide. Turtles sunned themselves on the upside-down roof of Ryland's Reflection, the cedar plaque long since carried downstream, and buried in silt like a coin in a pharaoh's tomb. The state put up a small bronze marker where the old inlet used to sing loudest. Ryland Lake, restored to 2025 by act of stewardship, water remembers. I didn't ask for the plaque. I would have stopped them if I'd known in time. But I let it stay. Some truths deserve to be written in metal. I still keep the Stormgate oiled. Every October, I hike the trail with a can of marine grease and a rag, clear the leaves from the trench, turn the wheel a 1/4 inch back and forth just to keep the threads honest. The upstream reservoir is smaller now. The county built a proper spillway after the flood, modern concrete and gauges and warning sirens. They asked my permission first. I gave it. Progress and memory can share the same mountain if both sides mind their manners, but the old gate remains mine. The county inspector signs the logbook, stamps it grandfathered, and leaves a six-pack of Coors on the concrete as quiet thanks. I drink one, pour one out for my father, and carry the rest home. Some nights when the moon is full and the wind is still, I sit on the porch and listen. The lake talks the way it always did, soft slap of wavelets against stone. The low croak of bullfrogs, the sudden splash of a bass hitting a mayfly, the far-off mournful call of a loon that nested here the first summer after the return and never left. If I close my eyes, I can hear my father's voice beneath it, all the same calm baritone that told me when I was 8 years old, "Take care of the water, son, and water will take care of you." He was right. It took care of the lies. It took care of the greed. It took care of me. I never married again after my wife passed. Never felt the need. The lake became my companion patient, forgiving, fierce when necessary. It asks nothing but respect, and it gives everything in return. People still come. Not many, but enough. They park at the pull-off walk, the quarter-mile trail stand at the water's edge in silence. Some leave flowers. Some leave handwritten notes tucked under rocks. One spring, a veterans group showed up in dress blues, formed two lines, and saluted the lake for a full minute. I watched from the porch with tears running into my beard and never felt more understood in my life. Last week, a little girl, maybe 7 red braids and missing both front teeth, marched right up the porch steps and handed me a crayoned drawing, a blue lake, a stick figure man in a hat, and the words, "Thank you for the water," in purple block letters. I pinned it above the kitchen window where the morning light hits it first. I still have the crank handle. It hangs on pegs inside the barn, wrapped in oilcloth, gleaming. I take it down once a year on the anniversary of the night I turned it, run a rag along the iron, and remember how heavy 15 years of waiting felt in my hands. Then I hang it back up. The gate no longer needs opening. The lake has its own voice now. But I keep the crank the way soldiers keep a sidearm long after the war is over, because some tools are also promises. Tonight the sky is clear, the Milky Way, a bright river overhead. I sit on the dock I built from the last salvageable timbers of the old cabins. Cedar still smells sweet after all these years, feet dangling in water that is cool and alive, and mine. A meteor streaks across the stars and vanishes. I raise my glass, just water tonight, and speak to the darkness the way I have every year since the lake returned. To the ones who tried to bury us, to the ones who forgot, and to the water that never did. The lake answers with a soft, contented sigh that wraps around my heart like my father's hand on my shoulder the day he taught me how to turn that wheel. I close my eyes. The frogs sing. The osprey cries once from its nest. And somewhere deep beneath the quiet surface, 15 years of silence, finally perfectly forgiven, the lake rocks me to sleep the way it rocked me when I was a boy who still believed the world was fair. It isn't fair. But sometimes when a man keeps a promise long enough, fiercely and alone, the world bends just enough to let justice slip through. The water remembers. So do I. And that has made all the difference.